big sky, big potential. In association with Mills and Reeve, this is Eastern Promise, achieving more together.
I'm Mike Rigby, and thank you for joining me as we share the full potential of the East of England all around the world. This, my friends, is the Eastern Promise podcast. Science is the East of England's stock in trade. Cambridge, our global capital of life sciences, and Norwich, the home of plant science. These twin worlds collide at the Quadram Institute, and I'll be chatting to the Institute's director, Professor Ian Charles OBE, and join Dr Tammy Dougan, Life Science and Healthcare Partnership Lead for the University of Cambridge, on a fact-finding tour of the QI. And finally, where's your coffee office, your latte lounge, your mocha meeting place? Let Eastern Promise be your barista for another caffeine-powered serving of CROWDSOURCERY. The Quadram Institute, on the Norwich Research Park, is at the forefront of a new frontier in science, where health, food, and innovation all meet. It's a healthcare facility and a clinical research institute into both food and gut health, that's solving some of the greatest mysteries posed by the link between what we eat and our physical and mental health. Co-location with the John Innes Centre, the Sainsbury Laboratory and Earlham Institute further facilitates the Quadram Institute's research, and the nearby Food Enterprise Park and Food Innovation Cluster make for an exciting ecosystem in the making. Of course, I wanted to know more, and I wasn't the only one. I invited Dr Tammy Dougan, Life Science and Healthcare Partnership Lead for the University of Cambridge, to come and see the QI, and you'll be joining Tammy and the Quadram Institute's Head of Public Affairs, Andrew Stronach, on her fact-finding tour of the QI very shortly. First, we sat down for a chat with the Director of the Quadram Institute, Professor Ian Charles OBE. Professor Ian Charles OBE, for which many congratulations, by the way. Thank you for welcoming myself, Mike Rigby of Eastern Promise, and
Tammy Dougan from Cambridge University,
to the Quadram Institute on a very sunny Wednesday morning with beautiful weather. Could you give us a very potted history of Professor Ian Charles, please?
Oh, there is a potted history, but as you can see, physically, you can see I'm a scientist of a certain age, so I have been around, and I started life in science, really. Well, my real interest in science started before I did a science degree, which was at St Andrews University. I was always interested and drawn to science. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that I ended up as a scientist, although perhaps not to other people around me at the time. My first love was tinkering with electronics. And I remember being captivated as a young man by what was the emerging field of home electronics in terms of what you could do with transistors, and working out my own little soldering iron and moving on to actually etching my own little circuit boards that I could plug my transistors into. This is all very good, of course, because I had a mathematical bent as well, so I was drawn towards that maths physics side. But then, strange volte-face. I remember reading something in probably the mid-1970s about genetic engineering, which was just starting. The Cohen-Boyer patents had been filed around 1972, and there was this great idea that you could take DNA from one organism and plug and play it in another organism. This was the start of cloning, the discovery of restriction enzymes. And this moment, I remember, it strikes you, if you know about biology, that the very same genes in bacteria, these lowly organisms, work in the same way that they do, to an extent, in human beings. Isn't that amazing? So there's this continuity of life that actually extends right across the planet. Yeah. So, and I was amazed by this. So I wanted to go into life sciences. So I ended up doing a degree at St Andrews. It was biochemistry, zoology background. And then on to do a PhD, and then on to various postdocs. But I'm unusual in the sense that I've worked in industry as well as in academia. So I've had various roles at Wellcome, Glaxo Wellcome, pharmaceutical companies, in academic, as a professor in teaching roles, and a professor in institutes, but also in the context of how we make societal impact. So I've worked on projects involving whooping cough vaccine, other vaccines, and I've also worked on spin-out companies. I've been very successful spinning out ideas, patents I've filed that have spun out into companies that have actually contributed to success in terms of deliverables. Yeah. So I've led a charmed life, but mostly it's to do with great people around me. So you can't emphasize enough about how this is really about teams and about building teams and working together in a collaborative way to deliver on expectations that society expects now from investment.
Yeah, definitely.
For those listening to this who might not know of the Quadram Institute, could you very quickly give us a quick overview of what it is you do here?
So Quadram is unique, I think, in terms of its of what the expectations are on Quadram. And I'll tell you more about the name first before we get into some of the detail, because Quadram, what does that mean? But I'll tell you that Quadram actually stands for the four partners. So quad, four, the four partners. And the four partners are BBSRC, which is an element of UKRI, our core funder. The Quadram Institute Bioscience is the old Institute of Food Research that was here before, and the majority, and you might know that.
I do remember it way well.
Okay, so it's an important part of that food science. And then, of course, the hospital, NNUH, and the university, UEA. Thus, the four partners, thus Quadram. Right. You've no idea what fun we had getting that name in the very early stages when the four partners were together. It involved locking us all together in a room for 2 days and coming up with ideas. And then we settled on Quadram. And you might think, well, that's a bit of a camel of a name, it's not really. But actually, it does signify the four partners, and it does signify that partnership. And I like that. And I like it still today. So there's Quadram, there's the four partners, but you can see from that the beginnings of this idea in the ground floor as you came in, the lower basement floor. It's one of the largest endoscopy units in Europe with a capacity to do 40,000 endoscopies a year. Now, endoscopies have really had a huge impact in the way gut health is perceived, because you can pick up early something that might be a tiny little adenocarcinoma or a tiny little, any form of cancer, and you can snip it out quite early. So if you get in early, these checks, intervention, are very useful, and it gives you a great insight. But it also means for us, in terms of a research organisation. We're working with partnership with the hospital, with endoscopy, and that means that we get access to all the ethics are done, everything's, a seamless way of delivering on biological samples. So we get this connection with patients immediately that allows us to help and improve what's going on in the gut by looking closely at human tissue itself. I think that's a fantastic opportunity for us. So that leads us on to the connections with the university, of course, because they have a school of medicine. It's the medics that work closely with the scientists. It's all the training, or all the interactions. We also have a biorepository, of course, where everything is done in terms of all the legal requirements, the ethical requirements. Everything is done so that it can be a seamless transition between clinical scientists, clinicians with scientific interests who want to work in certain areas, our scientists who are looking at that gut health element, and bringing that all together in context to deliver those biological samples. We also have a clinical trials unit where we can look at how we can test the impact of what we're doing on clinical populations. So you'll get to see this when you have a little tour around, and it's beautiful modern facilities. Now, we have clear mission, vision statements looking at the impact of food on health through the microbiome. Now, again, if I was a young scientist today, this is an area that I would find hugely fascinating. Imagine all these microorganisms living in us and around us. They're cooking up a storm of metabolites. They're doing all the cell signaling. They're doing all the bits of interaction with our human gut. And stuff is happening there that is impacting our health. We need to understand exactly what is happening there. We've talked about FMT in the context of this and the delivery. Fecal microbiota transplant, FMT, just for the avoidance of doubt.
Yes.
And so, and that's part of what we are doing and we would like to do. But it's only a tiny part of what we can and are doing here.
Okay, so the first thing I noticed when I came in here, I felt like I was walking into a patient area, very much, it almost, in a hospital, and in a very nice hospital.
We'll go downstairs and start from the bottom up.
And then you walk up the stairs, and you're in a lab area.
Yep.
So, I'd like to just see a bit more how this division, is there a division? Does it interact? How does it interact? So we go from the bottom and then...
Yeah, let's do that.
It's something you normally see quite separate, really, isn't it?
And I think
the patient-facing front with the lab. And it's the first thing that I noticed when I walked in.
Yeah.
It's
and I think speaking to our scientists, particularly the scientists who are based at the old IFR, which was a sort of 1960s laboratory building, you didn't see the public, but this is a public building. So you are reminded every single day that the science you're doing, who's it for? It's for the general public and our patients. So I think it's a really, really nice element of what the four partners came up with. The whole philosophy was, well, let's bring these elements together because that's how science works best. And I think it's really quite powerful.
I mean, it's very rare, very rare for patients wandering around into the healthcare setting to actually see labs this close, just there, isn't it?
We'll start here, really. The architects wanted to build a building that's like a cell, like an organism. It's got two sides. And within that organism, there's different elements from the different partners. So there's ourselves, Quadram Institute Bioscience, Prof at Norwich University Hospital, University of East Anglia, who have researchers who are embedded here. They work here permanently.
Okay, I was going to ask about that,
And bringing those elements together in terms of research into food, human health, gut microbiome and the interactions. And increasingly our links with John Innes Centre and TSL and Earlham Institute. So we have group leaders who are joint appointments. So they work across institutes and different elements.
Okay.
So it's kind of built in that kind of, and that's growing, as I think everybody understands that these are huge problems we're trying to crack, and you're not going to do it as one institute. You're going to have to work with partners to do that. So down here, in the lower ground floor, almost all of that is the endoscopy unit. So that's, I think, Europe's largest.
Yeah, it's got to be. It's pretty impressive in size.
It's a really interesting thought that when you're up on the upper ground floor, that underneath your feet, there are people who've come in for investigations and bowel cancer screening and all the rest of it. And as Ian said, it's a really, really useful facility and capability for us to have access to in terms of getting gut samples. And there's a biobank just over the road that's managed by the hospital as well.
Okay, brilliant.
So functionally, that's part of the hospital. It's managed by the hospital and it's staffed by them. Ian's the director of the institute as a whole, but obviously clinical management is managed by the clinical services. And it is a reminder for all of us every day about why we're doing what we do.
When Ian was having his interview at the corner of my eye, I could see patients coming in. And that's the first thing you see it continually, and it's a constant reminder.
It is. And Ian alluded to it, I spent 10 years as head of comms at the hospital, 5 years as head of comms at the university. And this is the one place I've ever worked where actually all of those elements are circulating in the same building at the same time. And that's really powerful, I think. And I think patients and carers get it as well. They're kind of we need to do a bit more work around engaging them, because for 2 years, because of COVID, we couldn't, the building wasn't open. You were coming in for specific reasons. But we're now in a place where we can do that. Any questions was a good example of bringing the public, and they loved it. Over there, you've got the hospital's R&D department. So from the hospital's on an evolutionary path from having been one of the country's biggest district general hospitals to early 2000s, it became a teaching hospital with the formation of the Norwich Medical School at UEA. And it's done a fantastic job of a teaching hospital that trains clinicians and doctors. And the next step of its evolution is to be a teaching hospital that's focused on clinical research as well. So their strategy is to kind of evolve that. And that's one of the cultural challenges that we think we can help them do, because we understand how research works. And they're making that transition from doctors who do service provision to doctors who do service provision and have a clinical research focus as well. So that's part of the mission.
I do love annual reports and accounts, which is a weird thing to say, but
That's possibly perverse.
I know, it's very bad. I'm trying to keep them up. But one thing you do get is a very good insight, particularly through strategic reports, into an organisation, what their goals are, aims for the future. One of the things that stood out to me in the one I read on the Quadram was how you're looking at the food that's that plant-based food that may be better for the planet, but there is still a question mark, perhaps, I mean, maybe unfair, but there's still a question over, is that food good for us? And I'm thinking particularly in terms of deficiencies in vitamin B12, which I know something that's being looked at by the Institute. I think Andrew here mentioned something about daffodil, I believe.
It was a cutesy experiment.
Well, you see, but from small acorns, as they say. What role is the Quadram going to play in ensuring that with industry, that the food that's better for the planet is better for the humans that are consuming it as well?
Well, there's a lot of work to be done in this area, because we need to define what's in food anyway, whilst we're understanding what are those elements that make food healthy or not healthy. Now, we know about global warming now, and we know we've left a little bit late to start doing stuff about global warming. Perhaps. It's a challenging statement, so I better moderate what I say. It's never too late. And so we need to understand what that impact on global warming will be on the way we produce food. Now, we produce food And it's quite interesting. Over the last, remember what happened with human beings and evolution. So over the last 10 or 12,000 years, we moved from a hunter-gatherer diet to a diet where we were cultivating crops that were better for us to cultivate, and that the agrarian revolution. So we settled on a few crops, wheat, corn, rye, barley, some of the grains, the grasses, and a few animal species, and we settled with those. That's a blink of an eye in terms of evolution, yes. But we've settled on those. Those are what there are. They're not necessarily the best or healthiest for us. They're just the foods that we happen to have had over the last 12,000 years or so, and our evolution has been part of that over a very short period. However, Homo sapiens of some form or another have been around for a bit longer than that. And so we've been evolved to eat other things. Now we need to explore what those other things might be, because we still have a repertoire of other food crops out there. I'm thinking even of things that we're beginning to look more seriously at now, like some of the millets, which don't have such a high glycemic hit, which might be contributing to some of the disease states that we're seeing. So there's a whole repertoire of foods we need to look at, in addition to those new foods like new burgers that don't contain any meat or whatever. So there are a range of opportunities for us to really understand what's in food and what impact it will have.
Well, I've been reached out to by one listener in particular, but to ask about your work on chronic fatigue syndrome and ME.
Yeah, well, this is quite interesting. I would say now that ME is a really interesting disease, and for a long time it's been misunderstood. And it might be there's not just one ME, but there might be lots of different etiologies that result in the same symptom. That's chronic. The chronic symptoms associated with disease, but they might have different etiologies, i.e. different causative, and we don't know. So it might be that the role of the gut microbiota plays in ME is significant. We need to do the experiment. So after all, we're scientists. So if you challenge me as a scientist in any situation, I'd say, well, we've got to be empirical. We've got to do the experiment to test the hypothesis. That's absolutely fundamentally important. This is what's beaten into you as a young scientist. You know this. we get these routes to take to actually test a hypothesis, and we need statistically significant numbers. We need to do the test that's well organized with all the right controls. And then we need to see what the answer is as a consequence.
Do you know, I find it's weird, but I find it immensely comforting when you say the words, we don't know, because that means there's so much left to be understood, so much left to discover, rather than, well, we think we know pretty much everything, so we know.
Well, I think one of the weaknesses you find in scientists is our brutal honesty. And that means we often fail in discussions with politicians who are black and white and they can say things. When I reflect on statements I make, as we always do, you think, well, did we actually know that? Do we really understand what's going on? And scientists tend to be brutally honest with themselves and say, actually, until we do the experiment, until we test it, then actually we don't know. It remains a hypothesis, and it remains to be tested. The more evidence we get that supports a hypothesis, great. And the more evidence we get from different routes, different experimental designs, we can move forward with certainty that that hypothesis is remaining testable and it's remaining intact. What you really want to do is find a killer experiment that really challenges that experimental situation. So you can reflect on it and say, well, that's not quite what we expected. But until then, you're testing hypothesis. Gravity, or theory of evolution, that's a hypothesis, but there's lots and lots of evidence on the way.
Yes. Having had I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know this, but having had some decade or more experience working with very closely with politicians, I absolutely understand where you're coming from, and seeing them sort of quiz scientists. It's if you were allowed to finish the sentence, that's quite a meeting of worlds.
Well, I think it's just often you find that politicians have some sort of legal or legalistic or backgrounds, or they may even have trained as barristers, and that's a completely different approach in terms of understanding and deriving truth. Yeah, because it might have some different meaning.
Yes, well, not always, but often it's to encourage you to give the answer they first thought of. So, but
I would never dream of saying that.
Just to kind of orientate ourselves, that's the endoscopy unit through there. So we are sort of on the lower ground floor now.
Uh-huh.
But this side of the unit is us. So that's microscopy in there. That's Cynthia Whitchurch, one of our group leaders, and Laura Nolan. Cynthia her research interest is biofilms, and she came over from Australia.
Oh, okay.
So she'd worked with Ian previously. She's an FAA, which is the Australian equivalent of a Royal Society Fellow. So she's brought her group here. Yeah, Matt Gilmore, who was Canada's sort of national microbiology lab director, he came over in the pandemic. He runs a group here, and he also runs a new food safety research network for the UK, which is funded by the Food Standards Agency and BBSRC.
Oh, okay.
So it's interesting to see just how much it's kind of brought new faces in, new thinking. So that's microscopy now. And this is one of the amazing things we do here, and we developed it with the Norwich University Hospital, is a treatment for specific groups of patients. And the treatment is something called fecal microbiota transplantation. And essentially it's a poo transplant, which sounds quite disgusting. But what you're doing is, if the analogy I'd use is you're reseeding a lawn, or perhaps a wildflower meadow. So people who've had a lot of antibiotics over the years, and that can sort of deplete the microbiome in the gut, and then Clostridium difficile likes that, it takes over, can make you very, very ill. And what you need to do is reseed that microbiome. So they get fecal material from a healthy person, put it into somebody with that kind of disease, and they recover. So we've done that for patients on the NHS. It's a NICE approved treatment. So it is a thing. It's a real thing.
When you say NICE approved treatment, you mean as in the National Institute for Clinical Excellence?
Yeah.
It's NICE approved.
What the National Institute for Clinical Excellence does is say, does this work, and B, is it value for money? And the answer is yes, it works, and yes, it's value for money. But because we have to now produce that material in a pharmaceutical standard facility, that's why we're spending this money currently. And it's going to be critically important for our research and for patient care, because we're looking to start the UK's only clinical intervention trial for ME patients.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, that's really exciting.
So that's a trial called Restore Me, and that will involve patients with ME either getting placebo or FMT. And the thinking behind that is that what underlies ME might be leaky gut syndrome as a result of post-viral infection. And leaky gut syndrome means the barrier between the gut microbiome and the rest of your body isn't working as well as it might do. And we think, Professor Simon Carding's group, the hypothesis is FMT will help restore that. And there's a huge pent-up demand from people with ME to take part.
I could imagine. It's probably...
It's interesting. The Department of Health published an interim plan last week, which we very much welcome, because it recognises that it's been under-researched. And the ME patients have been let down
pretty
by
much
the
ignored
community for a long time.
For a long time. I mean, how are you going to manage recruitment onto those trials? Because I could imagine it would be pretty popular.
It is very popular. What we've got is the study. Hi, James. The study has been developed with the NHS, and one of the NHS's only sort of ME services run by East Coast Community Healthcare, which is interesting, a community interest company that operates in Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft.
Okay.
And they deliver an ME service, so they have a pool of patients who live relatively local to us, because obviously there are issues about those patients may not be able to travel far.
Yeah.
So they have 100 patients who are ready, willing and able to take part. We just need to get this finished and signed off, and we're ready to roll.
That must be a really, really welcomed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in it, and a lot of people really desperate for kind of some solutions. And we hope we can provide some of the answers in due course.
You mentioned technology earlier, and I know that your colleague here, Dr. Dipali Singh, is part of the AI, has been selected for the management team of the AI in Bioscience Network.
Yeah.
So, and one of the points she makes in her blog post is on the QI website is quite interesting, in the fact that a lot of AI is used, we just don't call it that yet. Or we've used it for ages, we just haven't called it AI. So how can you see the development of those interactions between the use of AI growing, I should say, in what you do, and the increased interactions between the mathematic disciplines, the scientific disciplines, and the clinical disciplines?
So this is the next stage of evolution of science, and I think we're encountering it probably a little bit behind the physicists who were aware of AI, because they were having to manipulate vaster numbers. It's only now where we've got vast amounts of information, and it's either the genomic information, the genetic information, or it's the image information when we're doing high resolution imaging of microbial host cell interact, that sort of behavior. They require a lot of information, a lot of data processing, and it's where those science of physics, maths, biology all intersect. And I think this is the exciting period now. But I think we're at that period of evolution of science in general. Imagine, throw your mind back, if you can, from history books of Victorian level science or pre-Victorian, where steam trains or steam engines are just making an impact in the way that industry works, and suddenly everything changes as a consequence. Now, the cautionary note there is, of course, that society itself is impacted. So in a rush to embrace the new technology and the industrialization, there's an impact on society. So we need to be careful now, forewarned by our knowledge of previous big changes in science and the impact on society. We can be pre-warned, and we can take adequate precautions that we don't disrupt society too much as a consequence. But we could be heading into a golden age of understanding how we leverage science as a consequence of these machine learning, AI-based approaches. But we used to use and throw around the terminology big data. Yeah. But all data can be big. There's big data everywhere. There's lots and lots of information that these machines and their algorithms will give us insights if we ask the right questions.
Well, I hope we're doing that at
42.
the moment. 42, well, quite, yes, indeed.
So we're walking away from higher level pathogens down to lower level pathogens.
Here we are very much in the microbe area.
Yeah, we are. My wife's doing a PhD at the moment. She's an emergency medicine doctor, and her research interest is traumatic brain injury and trauma and coagulopathy. So what happened? Why do some people clot and some people don't clot?
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
So she's based at the Blizzard Institute in London. But she's been round, so your labs are better than our labs. Sequencing room. So Patrick Vallance came in February and formally opened the building.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And one of the things he was in. So this is where all the sequencing work for COVID was done. And that from your point of view, Mike, that small silvery grey machine plugged in, that sequences. That's a MinION. So what Patrick was struck by was, back in the day, it would have been a huge room.
Rooms full of sequencing.
And now it's what looks like a flash drive.
What I use just to plug in microphones is about more comparable to the size of the device behind it.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a very swift-looking computer, and if I thought I could get it out of the building, I would probably have it away.
Very expensive as well.
I bet. But for those who obviously can't see this, it's about half the size. This little winking grey silver box that Andrew mentions. It's about half the size of a mouse.
Yeah, that's right. It's really quite small.
Yeah.
And what the really exciting development for us and for science generally is that evolution. So further down the corridor, we've got commercial lab space. And in that commercial lab space is a group from Oxford Nanopore.
Oh, okay,
who
yeah.
Make
this,
these. But what they've done is Justin O'Grady, who was a group leader here and led our work on COVID sequencing, was enticed away by Oxford Nanopore. But he said, I don't want to leave Norwich. And I said, that's fine. So they're based at the Quadram, and we've licensed some of our IP that the World Health Organization has just endorsed in terms of sequencing drug-resistant TB.
Okay, yeah.
That it's effective and that it works. And why is that important? Because drug-resistant TB is a growing problem globally. Traditionally, clinicians have to wait for sputum samples to be cultured before they know what they're dealing with, and that can take days or weeks. But with this kind of technology, sequencing technology, that takes 5 hours. So you're giving clinicians the information they need within hours so they can target the right drugs and therapies.
Real-time patient care.
Real-time point-of-care diagnostics. And we're still at the beginning of this, but who have just endorsed that, and that some of that science came from here. So for us, that's incredibly exciting.
I bet.
And for Oxford Nanopore, even more exciting.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're based down there.
Excellent.
We liked him so much we brought in a lab.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's certainly academia industry relation
Yeah,
building
it
going
is.
on.
Yeah.
Horizon.
Yeah.
We were hoping the UK.
We were, weren't we?
And that kind of seems to be sort of on the, at the hang on a minute phase of negotiation. But on the basis, the optimistic basis that the UK rejoins at some point in the near future, what will that mean for the Quadram Institute and the NRP and the wider scientific body in the region?
Well, science is a language that transcends boundaries. And the same rules apply if you drop a ball from a certain height in France or in Britain. It will still descend at the same rate. And science is a universal language. And I think there's a duty almost on us to make sure that we are doing science with our partners in a way that benefits all of us.
You can hear an extended version of Tammy's tour on the Eastern Promise podcast feed. So, with the tour over, let's hear what Tammy made of the Quadram Institute and her impressions of the wider Norwich Research Park.
Tammy Dougan, we are now sat outside the gleaming Quadram Institute. They can't hear us now. So, what did you make of that then?
Oh, it was really, really fantastic. The first thing that struck me, as I said, when I walked in, the first thing you notice are the patients on the ground floor.
Yeah.
And then you can see up to the side, and you can see lab space. And it's that interaction between patient care and real research that I found really impressive. And then to find out the Quadram was because of the 4 institutes actually merged together, it was really impressive. It's probably more than I expected it to be in terms of I didn't quite realise the scale of the scale of the institute, firstly, and secondly, just how large the patient reach was with the largest endoscopy suite in Europe. So that did take me back a bit. Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of how knowledge of this place I don't expect you to make University of Cambridge policy on the fly, but how will knowledge of this place factor into what you do? We're so close. We're just down the A11. Yes.
And this huge area of microbiome and food research and the patient care that is so close to us, but really intertwined research areas that would be really beneficial from Cambridge to Norwich. It's really important to strengthen the ties between the areas, I think, yeah.
So how can Eastern Promise, the slightly self-serving question, how can Eastern Promise help you do that? And how can we work on that as people who sort of care about the science that's done in our region and want to see it succeed on a global level and do good for humanity broadly?
Just to highlight a bit more what's actually done here and what is here. I didn't realise the extent of the microbiome work that was carried out here. I didn't realise that, as I said before, the endoscopy suite was actually as large as it was. Just the cutting-edge research that's going on here, it's amazing. And I don't feel, unless I'd actually looked myself and tried to find out what was going on, I would have found out, because it's not a Cambridge institute from where I am, in the sense that it's in our area, but because it's a separate, it's classed as a separate university and a separate institute, it's not something we hear about as much.
No.
And I think it's a shame, because it's a really, really fascinating institute. I'm actually sitting outside it now, just still really impressed with not just the physical appearance and of the institute, but what goes on in here.
Well, I'm really, really thrilled that you're going to take away such a good impression to share what you've found, what you've seen. And it's been a real pleasure to have you with us today. I love it when other people get their voices heard on the podcast.
Really enjoyed it.
My huge thanks to Professor Ian Charles OBE, to Andrew Stronach, and especially to Dr Tammy Dougan of Cambridge University, for coming along with an open mind and for seeing not only the potential of the Quadram Institute and the Norwich Research Park, but also that we still have a job of work to do in improving the links between Cambridge and Norwich, our region's 2 centres of science, which are complementary, not competitors. Eastern Promise relishes the challenge, and we're here to do exactly that. And now, post-pandemic, we all like nothing better than to get out there and meet up with our contacts for a caffeine-infused catch-up. But where do you go for sparkling coffee and strong conversation? Or something like that. It's time to get milk on the side and a cinnamon swirl for another
CROWDSOURCERY.
Yes, CROWDSOURCERY. Let's brew up some answers, led by Adam Peed, Business Development Strategist at Innuti, and the brains behind adampeed.com. Says Adam, wow, there are so many great spots, but if pushed, number 1 for me, it has to be Dick's Bar in Norwich. I could work from there all day. In King's Lynn, it's Norbury's, more a weekend spot. I'm looking forward to reading the Cambridge suggestions. As am I, Adam. As am I. Chains are an easy out, but CROWDSOURCERY helps you to take the fear out of the frappe, so to speak, and try somewhere new with confidence. And here to help is Dave Graham, life science, medtech, biotech networker, and super connector. Dave tells us that he's been known to hang out near the Central Railway Station in Cambridge, moving from the library in the Clayton to the Venetian, with lunch at the old ticket office, then repeat in reverse in the afternoon. Oh, and Gale's Bakery. Friend of the show, Tarquin Bennett Coles, senior partner at SCI Partners, advisor for Guy Me Limited, pro bono mentor for the Homerton Changemakers. I was a Homerton last week, loved it. And Tarquin supports careers in healthcare for the MBA and EMBA students at the Judge Institute. Tarquin tells us he likes to use the independent coffee houses when he can. The Arts Picture House Cafe, in the day, in Cambridge is pretty quiet. And, says Tarquin, I have used the increasingly busy but fun Hot Numbers on Trumpington Street a few times. The Gog's Farm Shop used to have a great coffee shop, but COVID changed that, and they have a barn outside if you want a secluded, open-air feel. Lastly, the Copley Business Park has a bright, pristine cafe, free parking, for a discreet meeting for those based near Babraham or the A11. Now, this week's special guest, Dr Tammy Dougan, Life Sciences and Healthcare Partnerships Lead at the University of Cambridge, adds, Tarquin, I was there yesterday. She continues, my regular coffee office is Hot Numbers on Trumpington Street. I spend a fair bit of time there. I also frequent Fitzbilly's Cafe as a meeting point. I do now grab a giant cinnamon swirl from Gale's by the station if I want a close-to-station catch-up. I do like to meet away from the office. Tim Robinson, Chief Operating Officer at Tech East, agrees. Says he, Tammy, Hot Numbers is great. Tim also raves about First Coffee Shop in Woodbridge in Suffolk. Thanks to James Kindred for the mega tip, says Tim. Woodbridge. There's always something in Woodbridge. Chris Sargison, meanwhile, of Sargison Associates, agrees with Adam Peed at the top of the shop with a simple one-word recommendation. Dick's! Dave Graham returns to remind us that Dick's is not to be confused with Dirty Dick's. I sense a conspiracy to force me to say Dick's repeatedly on this podcast. In any case, Dave, Dirty Dick's is in London, and so inadmissible. So inadmissible. Finally, thankfully, decorum is restored by the wonderful Harriet Fear, MBE. Says Harriet, discovered Gale's a short while ago. Thank you, Becca, at Cambridge Science Centre. And the cafe at the Fitzwilliam is lovely, with antique ceramics around the corner to lust after. What's not to love? Nothing. Harriet, nothing is not to love. And on that note, you stay where you are. I'll get this one. That was episode 77 of the Eastern Promise podcast. This podcast will be taking a very short break, not just because of my streaming cold, as we prepare for our event on the decarbonisation of heritage, which is taking place at Jesus College on the 12th of October. This event is now entirely sold out, which, for the first live major Eastern Promise event, is incredibly humbling. But never fear, you'll be able to hear what went on soon enough. It only remains for me to thank yet again Professor Ian Charles OBE, Andrew Stronach, Dr Tammy Dougan, and to all my crowdsourcerers for another bumper delivery. Thank you too to Engineer 49, who works like a dog. Thankfully, he does it all pro bono. What? And lastly, thank you to you for your company. If anything you've heard today strikes a chord, reach out via the Eastern Promise website, easternpromise.org.uk, or by emailing me at mike@easternpromise.site, or look me up on LinkedIn, Mike Rigby or Eastern Promise. The DMs are always open. I look forward to hearing from you. Until episode 78 is finally with us. Bye for now. To listen to more episodes of the Eastern Promise podcast and find out more about what we do, please visit easternpromise.org.uk. Eastern Promise is a Priors-Croft production in association with Mills and Reeve, achieving more together.